On Valentine's Day earlier this year, one of the most despicable acts of evil in American history took place in Parkland, Florida, when a gunman opened fire at a high school with an AR-15 rifle and murdered 17 people and injured several more. Only a few short months later in Texas, a similar case happened with an AR-15 in a church, another horrible day for America. Understandably, Americans are distraught and want politicians to act. One thing you probably didn't hear about the Texas shooting, however, is who really saved the day. A good man with an AR-15, who was a member of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, quickly took action. He shot at the assailant, injuring and impairing him from causing further destruction. Instances in which guns properly serve the public are multitudinous and unreported. My claim today is that guns are not an epidemic in America, and nor do they pose a threat to Americans that can be solved with gun control legislation. Understandably, you may be skeptical, but I will use two broad arguments to underline my point. One, that gun violence and mass shootings are not a pandemic issue that mostly affect law-abiding citizens, and two, that guns make us safer, and that gun violence cannot be solved with gun control legislation. In the first issue, let's start with the number of gun-related deaths to have a perspective. Every year, an average of 30,000 people die from guns, still less than the national average of car accident-related deaths. Of those 30,000, 61% are suicides, not homicides. This means that a significant minority of gun-related deaths are not murders. Of those that are murders, roughly 2/3 are perpetuated by and committed against convicted criminals. According to the City of Charlotte gunshot study in the Department of Criminal Justice, 71% of gunshot victims have had previous arrest records, and 64% have been convicted of a crime. This is not meant to imply in any way that their deaths are unimportant or justified, but to illustrate that most gun violence in America already takes place in gang-related circles. In fact, according to the Center for Disease Control, a staggering 80% of homicides are gang-related. The people who participate in crime in gangs are not likely to buy a gun legally. In fact, buying a gun legally and then killing someone with it is so rare that even PolitiFact.org confirms that only 3 to 11% of all guns used in homicides are purchased legally in a retail store. Think of that number. That means at least 9 in 10 murders are committed with guns outside of our already pre-existing laws. 325 million guns in America are simply too many guns for the federal government to regulate effectively. You may ask, why not just confiscate all guns? Wouldn't that work? Well, this has been tried before. Australia had a mandatory buyback program for all Australians who owned guns, which were far fewer than the American rate of gun ownership. And yet Australia only saw a 1/3 compliance rate of people who were ready to give up their guns. Do you seriously believe that Americans will have a better compliant rate than the disappointing Australian figure? We will then see hundreds of millions of illegal guns in the black market for a new Pandora's box of disasters. How about AR-15s, or so-called assault rifles? Well, shootings with assault rifles are so rare that in 2011 the FBI reported that 1,694 people were killed with knives, 726 people were killed with hands or feet, 496 people were killed with hammers or clubs, and 323 people were killed with rifles of any kind, including assault rifles. That means that the number of people that were killed with hammers is twice that of people that were killed with assault rifles. And to reassure students that school shootings are not an epidemic, according to the Washington Post and an assessment of statistics given by the Education Department, quote, the statistical likelihood of any given public school student being killed by a gun in school or any given day since 1999 is roughly 1 in 614 million. And since the 1990s, school shootings have been getting less common, end of quote. This means that you are well over 200,000 times more likely to be struck by lightning in your life than to be shot and killed at school. Now, why are we safer with guns? Well, a study by researchers Gary Kleck and Mark Gertz, published in 2013, concluded that as many as 200,000 women every year use a gun to protect themselves against sexual abuse. Yet another study by the Center of Disease Control reported on a survey that concluded that there were anywhere from 500,000 to 3 million instances in which Americans used guns to stop a homicide or defend themselves, often by just brandishing the gun. Although a limited study, the figures from this survey tell us that guns may save at least 33 people for every one that they murder, or at most, save well over 100 times more people than the number of homicides. How about crimes that don't involve murder? Remember Australia's mandatory gun buyback? Well, according to Australian crime statistics, after the gun confiscation, home burglaries increased threefold, probably burglars that were unafraid of an unarmed populace. We're always told that airbags save 30 people for every one that they kill. I've yet to hear thunderous protesting and nationwide conferences on airbag safety. When we put numbers into perspective, I conclude there is no statistical, factual, or otherwise compelling case for increased gun control in America. The American reality of guns may otherwise be difficult to accept given our current circumstances, but we are all safer with guns in our lives, and there's little to nothing we can do about the current state of gun crime by implementing gun control. Thank you and have a great day.
All right, well, the proposition's identified, but it does have a couple of negatives in it, which makes it a little bit confusing. The contents are previewed. There are just 2 supporting points, which is interesting because it was harder to figure out where the second supporting point started in the body of the speech, and there are just 2 of them, so it should be easier to pick out rather than more difficult. The thing that you have going for you the best is that you have a lot of data that you're presenting. There's a lot of statistical information about gun homicides, about the relationship to other kinds of deaths like suicide, the notion that guns are used primarily within particular contexts, and you'd minimize the risk for school shootings, for instance, in substantial ways. I thought that that was fine. The factual data that you had on the number of deaths that occur as a result of rifles in comparison to other kinds of weapons, I thought that's a pretty effective piece of information to use to make your point. Like I said, though, it really feels like that whole first point just turns into a long line of data without necessarily any claims that go along with it. I think there are claims, but they're harder to pick out because there's so much data, and that's why a structure, I think, needs to be a little bit more elaborate than what you've got here. I thought there was good research in the presentation, like you were consistent about citing sources. You mentioned the CDC a couple of times. There was not any reference to where the information about Australia came from. I'm assuming that's pretty much factual data, but there still should be some source citation on it. And then we got a couple of studies that you referred to as well. Like I said, I think the biggest issue are structural issues, but when it comes to data, you're very solid. All right, thank you.